This microphone, thanks. This microphone is only for our friends who are joining us in Toms River today. So this event is being live streamed to the Kane Ocean campus. If you could turn around and wave to the camera, and you can say hello to everyone in Dr. Esposito's American Revolution class.
About Dr. Esposito not actually having to teach the class.
Exactly, Frank. He said that, not me. All right. So Thursday, October the 26th, is our Halloween lecture, which will be delivered this year by Dr. Jackie Stoneberg on Ancient Greek Occult Amulets, Greek Magicians' Manuals Explain All. So definitely be there. And then on the following Monday, October the 30th, the next installment for the America Now series will be a teach-in panel on anti-Semitism in the modern era. Okay, so mark your calendars and plan to be there. Today we're delighted that we can share these offerings, as I said, with your classmates, with your peers in Kane Ocean. And all of us, whether we're sitting in Toms River or we're sitting here, are in for a treat. We're delighted to have with us today Dr. Mark Lender, Professor Emeritus here at Kane University. Most of the students in this room will not have been here long enough, we hope. If you do remember Dr. Lender, we're not doing our jobs. Most of you students will not remember Dr. Lender. But until his retirement just a few years ago, Dr. Lender served Kane University as Vice President and Provost. And before he took that role, he served as Chair of the Department of History. And as Chair, he oversaw the hiring of many, if not most of us who are teaching your classes today. Yeah. He was tasked with, and he built the Department of History, as you all know it. At the same time, he was demonstrating his ability to embody the administrator/teacher/scholar model, continuing his research on colonial and revolutionary American and New Jersey history. For Dr. Lender is one of the most accomplished scholars in his field, and the space that his work occupies on bookshelves dedicated to revolutionary America is expanding. Among his many publications are his History of the United States District Court in New Jersey, his Respectable Army, The Military Origins of the Republic, and Citizen Soldier, The Revolutionary War, Journal of Joseph Bloomfield, soon to be out in paperback, I believe. And, as always, Drinking in America, a history, for those of you interested in that topic. Today, he's here to talk about his latest work, Fatal Sunday. And to introduce the book and talk, I'm going to turn the podium over to Dr. Mercantini, here today in his capacity, not necessarily as acting dean of the College of Liberal Arts, but as a colonial American historian. Dr. Mercantini.
Thank you, Dr. Hyde. And just to echo what Dr. Hyde said, it very much is Mark who is responsible to our eternal thanks and credit for creating the Department of History into the vibrant and really exemplar department that it is at Kane University. And we think about him often, and we think about him fondly. And so it's exciting and very enjoyable to welcome him home. His lecture today is drawn from his recent and prize-winning book, Fatal Sunday, George Washington, the Monmouth Campaign, and the Politics of Battle. The book received the Society for Military History's 2017 Distinguished Book Award, and it was also a finalist for the George Washington Prize, which is the most prestigious book award in colonial and revolutionary American history. The book has already received multiple demands. I went on Amazon, and it's already in reprint editions because of the considerable demand and the wonderful and well-deserved outstanding reviews that the book has received. The book is co-authored with Gary Wheeler Stone, and Dr. Lender goes out of his way in the book's introduction and in the acknowledgments to explain the really vital and central role that Mr. Stone played in the construction of the book, and Mark is very gracious in sharing that, but it's clearly a collaborative endeavor. The book really is a model of historical scholarship. Dr. Lender has written the definitive account now of one of the major battles of the War for American Independence, but he doesn't stop with just a recounting of the battle. I mean, he wrote over 400 pages about something that happened in one day, no small feat. And he does that in part because, like any good historian and any good scholar, he's broadening out the importance, the significance, the things that all of us are emphasizing in our classes. History is much more than just the names, the dates, and the places. This battalion was on this hill at this time. They shot this way. They then retreated because the British were firing back, or whatever it might be. That's important, but that is a different kind of scholarship than what Dr. Lender has done here in Fatal Sunday, because what he's been able to do is to offer an innovative interpretation of George Washington's leadership. The book is a powerful reminder that Washington's unchallenged place as the father of our country, even today, was far from assured in the summer of 1778. And it's really this innovative thesis that makes the book stand out. The book is a wonderful work of military history. It's an amazing work of political history as well. And finally, the book is an outstanding example of how scholarly history, well-researched, richly sourced, powerfully argued, can reach a popular audience. So much of us are consumed by the news and the use and misuse of history, historical fact, or misinterpretation, and historians as a field are constantly struggling with how do we reach a broader audience. And that really is a struggle for the academics to reach the popular side, and for the popular side to create narratives, to create interpretations that really do make the scholarly community resonate. Dr. Lender has done that as well. So it's my great pleasure on my own behalf, on behalf of Kean University, most of all on behalf of the Department of History, to introduce Mark Edward Lender.
When somebody gives you the guys down in Ocean do. Okay, I've got to use this thing. Somebody gives you an introduction like that, what you want to do is just sit down, tell the guy to keep talking. Thank you, Jonathan. I do appreciate it. Jonathan mentioned the book was a finalist for the George Washington Prize. We were very pleased with that. The finalist got a beautiful, suitable for framing embossed certificate in a lovely leather portfolio. The winner, who was a friend of mine, he's still a friend, he hasn't beaten me, got a beautiful, suitable for framing certificate, embossed, and a lovely leather portfolio, and a check for $50,000. I was okay with that. My wife, I don't know. Would have been nice. But it is nice to be back. Thank you for showing up, and it shows what threats can do as a teaching tool. That accounts for all the students who came here, I'm sure. But look, I was asked to give a book talk, meaning if you came to hear a lecture about the Battle of Monmouth, you're not going to get it. What you're going to get is a talk about a book about the Battle of Monmouth, or aspects of the Battle of Monmouth. So I'm going to deal with it in 5 or 6 questions. Why did we go about writing this book? What were those things that attracted us to the subject? And what really were some of the key questions that we addressed and hopefully answered, sometimes for the first time, sometimes addressing questions that others had looked at, but we came to a different answer. Let's look at a couple of them. And Beth, I'm going to ask you to advance this thing occasionally. I did put some slides together for you, just so when I give you the high sign, or I'll click this, one or the other. I grew up in New Jersey, and I'm assuming most of you, who grew up in New Jersey, or who did not grow up in New Jersey? What's wrong with you? But I did, and I grew up in northern New Jersey, then moved to central New Jersey, and Freehold, New Jersey, the site of the Monmouth campaign, or the critical day of the Monmouth campaign, was something that it's still there. It's Monmouth Battlefield State Park. It's remarkably well preserved, one of the best preserved of the Revolutionary battlefields, a wonderful place to spend the day. I was always curious about what was purported to be, one, the most confusing battle of the American Revolution, that historians have long ago given up trying to figure out exactly what happened, and two, it was the longest single day of combat in the War for Independence, and it always occurred to me that this was a tactical draw. We'll talk about why I think it was a tactical draw, that the Americans got what they wanted, the British got what they wanted, But at the same time, Washington's reputation emerged as enhanced as never before. I could never really figure that out, so a long, long time ago, when I say a long, long time ago, I became interested in this, the 1990s. Most of you weren't even, or a lot of you weren't even born. Started to put together resource materials. Maybe there's a book in this, maybe not. Produced a manuscript about 1993. Was about to submit it to Rutgers University Press when something happened. What has a battle in Montana got to do with a battle outside of Freehold, New Jersey? This is an Anheuser-Busch commercial for Budweiser beer, Custer's Last Fight. Well, in the early 1990s, a prairie fire swept over the battlefield at Little Bighorn. For the first time, archaeologists were able to get in to Little Bighorn and begin to dig it up. And what they found was enough archaeological evidence to figure out what happened to George Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry. What they found was that the Indian accounts of the Battle of Little Bighorn were generally dead accurate. We should have been believing it for over 100 years. But now, this struck me as something important, because I had written a manuscript on the Battle of Monmouth with no reference to what archaeology might tell us about that battle. So I called a friend of mine named Gary Wheeler Stone. Well, you saw Gary's name on the book cover earlier. Gary's an archaeologist, had his PhD in American Studies from Penn. He was in charge of the Monmouth Battlefield State Park. And I said, Gary, I've written this manuscript, and he was kind enough to read chapters for me as we went through it. I said, I can't publish this thing now. You guys haven't started the archaeology. And if I publish this book now, and you guys dig up the Monmouth Battlefield, and the archaeology was planned, I said, if you find something different, I'm going to look like an idiot. That's not what historians strive to do. I delayed it. Did all sorts of things in the interim, other book projects, job change, got married. I think Penny has lived with this project for our entire marriage. And sort of let it go. And over time, Gary and his team dug up the Monmouth Battlefield. Thank God I waited. When I retired, I had time to turn back to this project, which was on the shelf literally for a couple of decades. I said to Gary, look, you've got the archaeology, I've got the literary evidence, let's team up, we'll co-author this thing and get it done. That's how the two authors came together, and that's how a historian meshed his evidence with the stuff that an archaeologist dug up. And by the way, Gary is one of the best archaeologists working in Revolutionary America today. I was extremely lucky. We'll talk, at least in one episode later on this morning, about one of the new things that we found, actually fairly shocking. Okay, let's put this campaign in context. What brought about the Battle of Monmouth? In 1778, the French entered the American Revolution, formed an alliance with the rebellious government, and the British were faced with a cold-blooded strategic decision. They had been unable to defeat Washington's army. They had lost an army in the north, the Battle of Saratoga. We'll talk about that in a second. The French were in the war. The Spanish were threatening to come into the war. In fact, they came in the next year. And the year after that, the Dutch were in the war. Great Britain, having launched or having been involved in what was a colonial rebellion, by late 1778 was in fact fighting for her life. They had to make a cold-blooded decision. We can't fight everywhere. The decision was to pull out of most of the Northern American colonies, and that meant giving up Philadelphia, which they had won in 1777, getting their army back to New York to be redeployed to the American South, to the Caribbean, to Florida, to defend those colonies the British thought were economically and strategically more important than New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, the American North. These are the antagonists we're talking about. George Washington by Charles Wilson Peale. Charles Wilson Peale was sort of the portraitist of the American Revolution. If you were an American officer and you had a few dollars to spend, you were at Valley Forge, you got your portrait painted by Charles Wilson Peale. The reason we use this picture in the book was because it was probably finished about a month before the Monmouth campaign opened in June of 1778. So that's about as close as we're going to get to what George Washington looked like during all of the events we're going to be talking about. This was his antagonist, General Sir Henry Clinton, competent general, member of Parliament, took over as British Commander-in-Chief only a couple of weeks before the Monmouth campaign opened. He was furious with his orders. Who wants to be appointed Commander-in-Chief when your orders tell you, give up the chief prize of the campaign of 1777. Give up Philadelphia, get your army back to New York, because we're going to take most of that army away from you. He was livid. What he wanted to do, somehow, anyhow, was draw the Continental Army into a fight. If he couldn't destroy the Continental Army, he at least wanted to land a major blow, personal satisfaction for himself, and to somehow redeem the honor of British arms, because giving up on what they'd won in 1777 was a blow to morale. His officers hated the idea of evacuating Philadelphia as well. Okay, we've got to consider George Washington for a second, because there was a political dimension to all of this. Washington was under heavy political fire over late 1777 and into early 1778. When I say heavy political fire, there were people who wanted to fire him. We have to drop back on the military history of the British Empire. During the 7 Years' War, called the French and Indian War, over here in North America, British general after British general who did not win was fired. The American colonials knew this. In Continental Congress, you had congressmen who stood up and said, we know what the precedent is. If you don't win, you get relieved, and we replace the person with somebody who might win the war. I think in the 7 Years' War, the British went through 5 commanders-in-chief over here. That was the lesson, and Washington knew it. And what was his record? He was whipped at Brandywine in September of 1777. A few days later, his forces were surprised and whipped at Paoli. They were whipped there by General Charles Gray, who ordered his men to remove the flints from their rifles and just go in at night, nothing with cold steel, the bayonet. Ever after, he was Charles No Flint Gray. The Americans didn't stand a chance. They were absolutely stunned by this attack. Again, Washington's beaten. Washington counterattacks at Germantown in October, and he's whipped again. This is not a particularly impressive record as a commander. So there were other antagonists. Aside from the British and Henry Clinton, Washington had to watch his back because there were people out to get him. There's an episode called the Conway Cabal we do not have time to go into today, and some historians believe it, some don't. Whether or not there was an actual plot to replace Washington, there is no doubt that many in Congress and officers in the Army were dead serious about finding a new commander-in-chief. And we'll talk about that, what I'm working on today. I believe that the so-called cabal actually was real, and I think the next book will prove it, but we'll let that go. This is General Horatio Gates, and this is General Thomas Mifflin. I think in real life, Mifflin's head wasn't so squashed, but it's just not a real good picture of him. This is a man who had been Washington's chief aide early in the war. After Washington was beaten in late 1776 and after the defeats in 1777, Mifflin turned against him, thought he was listening to the wrong subordinates, served as quartermaster general of the Army, did a very problematic job, ultimately resigned and got heavily into the politics of the war. And he was politicking, intriguing against Washington's command. This is the guy that Thomas Mifflin wanted to replace Washington. Horatio Gates, who at the same time while Washington is losing in the Middle Theater in 1777, is winning at Saratoga. These were the guys who were listening to Mifflin and Gates. So much of this opposition to Washington has been cast in terms of good guys versus bad guys. That's nonsense. The people who had doubts about Washington were patriots. This is Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence from Pennsylvania, probably the most prominent American physician of his day. Hardly a man who wanted to lose the war, but he wanted a winning general. This is James Lovell of Massachusetts, an astringent critic of Washington, probably the longest serving member of the Continental Congress between late 1776 all the way through to the end of the war. Objected to Washington not only on practical grounds and the guys losing the war, but also on ideological grounds. The same thing with Rush. They did not believe that Washington should be building a regular American army. Professionals are the tools of tyrants. What we want is an army of armed citizenry. We want the militia. It was an ideological matter, tough to grasp today, now that we don't have conscription anymore. But they honestly believed a citizenry in arms could take on any professional army the world could send against them. It was nonsense, by the way, but they believed it. This is Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, sort of a moderate politically and a friend of Washington. The Lees were as high on the social and economic scale of old Virginia that you could get. They were intimates of Washington who just came to believe that his friend couldn't win the war. This is William Duer of New York, a conservative, a businessman. And he looked at the army like a business operation. And if the business operation is failing, what do? You get rid of the CEO, in this case the CIC, the commander-in-chief. He didn't believe that Washington could win because he didn't know how to manage the army. These were indicative of others who had their doubts about Washington. But they were patriots. And so we get this idea that this is all animosity against Washington. It was animosity based upon ideological and practical concerns. Go ahead. All right. The other question is, given the difficulties Washington was facing, he was under political fire, and now we've got the British evacuating. They left Philadelphia on the 18th of June, 1778. Their job was to get from Philadelphia back to New York City. They had come originally by sea. They did not march to Philadelphia across New Jersey in 1777. But in 1778, the Royal Navy informed General Clinton, you can't get away by ocean. We don't have enough transports. We can get your heavy equipment. We can get thousands of Tories who want to leave Philadelphia. If you were a Tory and you had come out in favor of the British during the occupation, you did not want to hang around for, how shall we phrase this, political re-education by the patriots who were going to come back in and reoccupy the city. They did things like hang you, confiscate your property, force you into exile. We don't like to use the word terror as we talk about the American Revolution. There was plenty of terror. And when the Tories wanted to get out, they knew what they were fleeing. He could get some of the army. He put some regiments whose loyalty he thought might have been doubtful aboard the ships. The ships took off, and Clinton has to take about 18,000 troops, camp followers of all types, and march them about 96 miles from Philadelphia across to New York. The roads are bad. The weather was horrible. We have guys who were killed by lightning. The storms were so violent. The heat, there was one day of recorded heat in Philadelphia of 104 degrees. Most of the march across New Jersey occurred at temperatures above 90 degrees. Humidity, high heat, what comes out? What's the New Jersey state bird? The mosquito, right? If you read the accounts of the British soldiers, marching across New Jersey through South Jersey. They were absolutely miserable. The British were not amateurs, by the way. There are all sorts of, it's folklore really, of British soldiers dropping dead because they were wearing these heavy red woolen uniforms. Plenty of soldiers on both sides dropped dead from the heat, but not because they were wearing their heavy uniforms. The troops were ordered, cut it down to shirts, wear very light pants, put your other stuff on the pack train. We'll try and get that across to New York without you having to wear it. Even without the heavy uniforms, though, a British soldier was probably carrying an average of about 60 pounds as he marched, between pack, rations for a couple of days, weapons, ammunition. It was not an easy time. Okay, just very quickly, because we're going to be talking about it, this is what the battlefield looked like. I'm not going to go into the details of the battle. But there is a bias to this that we do need to know about. If you're here in the East, and Monmouth Courthouse was, the name was alternating between Monmouth Courthouse and Freehold. Ultimately, the name was stabilized as Freehold. But the period we're talking about is right when that transition was occurring. But if you're here in the East, you're on higher ground than anybody in here to the west until you hit this area called Perrines Hill. Then you've got a clear view pretty much all the way to the east. So if somebody is coming from the east and attacking somebody down here, you're going to have a military advantage because you're going to be higher, able to see better, and actually be able to fire down on people. Okay, let's take the next one. This is just the same thing writ large so you get a better view. I'm going to point out just a couple of terrain features. This is pretty much gone. There's a couple of history professors who live there. Chris, you're in Freehold, right? Frank Frayer, also down in the area. This is all pretty much gone through development today. But if you go down to the state park, this is all pretty much still here. This is called the Point of Woods, and this is, what's the county road, Chris? 537? 537, right. That road is still there. This is called the Point of Woods because that section dipped below the road. Oh, the microphone, I'm sorry. Listen, kids, Frank Esposito knows about all this anyway, so it doesn't really matter, okay? So this is the hedgerow. It was a fence through which a whole bunch of stuff had grown. The hedgerow was there. That's where some of the most difficult and bitterest fighting of the war took place. All this is orchards. It's still orchards today. The hedgerow was there until like the 1980s. And in all innocence, they brought in a contractor to just do a little land clearing for the benefit of the orchard. He didn't realize it. He saw this pile of bramble and everything, took it out. The Boy Scouts put it back in, so you can go down and see the hedgerow today. It's grown back. This is Perrines Hill, where Washington would bring up the main American army, and that's where the American artillery would be sighted for most of the battle. Remember, this is higher than what's down here, so if you're attacking up Perrines Hill and they've got artillery up here, you're going to be in bad shape if you're the attacking force. Now, the other question is this. Remember I mentioned that there were some objections to Washington building a professional army? That's another question we looked at. We know that over Valley Forge, or the Valley Forge winter, Washington did try to build a professional army, much to the disgust of people like Benjamin Rush and James Lovell. He ultimately settled on a German, Friedrich Steuben, sometimes called von Steuben. Actually, the title of nobility was a title of courtesy. When he tried to come to America, he billed himself as a baron who was a lieutenant general on the staff of Frederick the Great. He was not a nobleman, and he was a captain on the staff of Frederick the Great. A captain is a long way from a lieutenant general. But he struck a guy in Paris named Benjamin Franklin, who was the chief American envoy in Paris, as a capable individual who might help train American troops who badly needed training. So Washington dusted up his resume a little bit. A lot, actually. And he came to America and impressed Congress because he agreed to serve as a volunteer. I don't need to get paid. If I do the job, then you can figure out a rank for me and you can figure out what I ought to get paid. Steuben impressed Washington, and he put together a model company. I'm going to train one company, show the rest of the Army how it's done, and then we're going to take what that company learned and spread it through the rest of the Army. His problem was he did not speak English, and he's dealing with an American Army. This was difficult because he would get frustrated and he would start swearing at the troops in German. And the troops, they began to laugh. So he had an aide named Walker. Walker did not speak German, but Walker spoke French and English. The Baron, by courtesy, spoke German and French. So what he would do is he would arrange with Walker to sit next to him as he trained them, and when he burst into a bout of frustration, he would tell Walker in French, I can't swear at them in English, I want you to swear at them in English. So he would speak to Walker, translate it, Walker would then swear in English at the troops, who thought this was hysterical. Steuben turned out to be one of the most popular officers in the Army during Valley Forge because he knew how to deal with soldiers. He had that touch, and he was a stern disciplinarian, but he knew what he was doing when he's having Walker swear at them in English. He knew the guys loved it. They responded. Washington spent a lot of time working directly with Steuben, issued absolutely strict orders. I don't care if you don't agree with what Steuben is doing as we train your regiment. You're going to do exactly what the Baron tells you to do. I want this Army to have a uniform standard of discipline and a uniform standard of drill. When I say that, what you were dealing with prior to this was different regimental officers training their regiments along different standards of maneuver. You get into a fight and somebody says, come online, bring your brigade online, and a brigade is made up of regiments. And one officer thinks that means A, and another officer thinks it means B, and another officer thinks it means C, you're going to be in big trouble. What Steuben tried to do was standardize all of that. He made a great deal of progress. The other guy who was working was a guy named Henry Knox. Knox was chief of American artillery. Weighed in the area of 300, 320 pounds. It was very tough to find a horse that could support Henry Knox. But he was a superb artillery. He was a bookseller. He had a bookshop in Boston. What he knew about artillery, he learned from reading the books he was trying to sell. But he had a knack for it, and it worked. And while Steuben is training the infantry, Knox is training the artillery. Then Washington grasps General Nathaniel Greene, a young man from a Quaker family. He sort of gave it up, but his heritage was Quaker. But now, against his objections, Washington asks him to be the quartermaster general of the Army. Look, the history of quartermasters, supply, logistics, is not sexy military history. Who wants to read about how they kept inventories of muskets in Lancaster, Pennsylvania? It's not exciting, but that's what you've got to do to keep an army in the field. It was Irvin Rommel in World War II who said, the quartermasters have won or lost the battle before anyone fires the first shot. If you don't have the ammunition, the food, the gas, a modern army doesn't move. In those days, if you didn't have hay, fodder, oats, the army didn't move. It was horsepower. If you couldn't control inventories, we had one case where there were plenty of beef. They're starving at Valley Forge. 40 miles away, there's herds of beef. And there's no way to move them. There's nobody to drove them. There's nobody to drive the wagons to bring the fodder to keep them alive until they're slaughtered. It was just an administrative mess. Greene didn't want to do it. He was out for military glory. He's a young man. His great quote is, "Who ever heard of a quartermaster in history?" Thank God he took the job, because Steuben is dealing with the infantry, Knox is dealing with the artillery. Green straightens out the logistical mess that almost had the Army starve at Valley Forge. He worked with a guy named Jeremiah Wadsworth, who took care of commissary. That's the actual food and stuff. After Valley Forge, the American Army is in better shape than it has been at any time during the American Revolution. How much better? We don't know. They haven't fought a major campaign. Let's see what we got here. Major General Charles Lee. Interesting guy. Just as some of you have got laptops, might want to Google something. Google Benedict Arnold, traitor. See how many hits you get. And when you're done with that, Google Charles Lee, traitor. See how many hits you get. I mean, if you call someone a Benedict Arnold, is that a compliment? Shake heads no. Please shake heads no. You know who Benedict Arnold was, right? Who doesn't know who Benedict Arnold? Don't embarrass yourself by raising your hand. Benedict Arnold, of course, the great traitor, had been an American hero, turns traitor, goes over to the British in 1780. Charles Lee has also been accused of being a traitor. He was not. Charles Lee had been captured as a prisoner of war in December, late December of 1776, disobeying orders by not marching his army as rapidly as possible across New Jersey to join Washington, who was then planning the counterattack at the Battle of Trenton. He thought he would do better by staying behind in New Jersey and disrupting the British rear. Also, he had lost all faith in Washington after the defeats of late 1776. Everyone in this room has met Charles Lee. Charles Lee was brilliant, and you've all met someone who's brilliant. Charles Lee is not only brilliant, he also knew he was smarter than you, and you've met people like that. Not only was he smarter than you, but he also knew that he should waste absolutely no opportunity to let you know as much. That's the kind of guy he was. And he was smart. And you've met people like that too. He was probably the most sophisticated man in America, short of Benjamin Franklin. He read Shakespeare. He was fluent in 3, maybe 5 languages. Widely read, a former British officer who came to America after he was unable to gain promotion to senior rank in the British Army. A political radical, was one of the first in America to say that the colonies ought to declare independence. He had fought very, very well in the early days of the war, established a reputation among Americans that made him a genuine national hero. It was considered a real tragedy when he was taken prisoner in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. A British raid caught him. The British thought this was wonderful. We've knocked out their most competent commander. Both sides had an awful lot of respect for Charles Lee. Charles Lee, however, was friendly. Remember those critics of Washington we showed you a slide of a few minutes ago? Those were his people. And they were really upset when Lee was captured. Lee did not believe in building that professional army. Like Gates, like Mifflin, like some of those other critics we mentioned, he had much more faith in an army of militia. Now, he is exchanged and joins the army at Valley Forge only a couple of weeks before the British evacuate Philadelphia and the Monmouth campaign launches. He is the second-ranking officer in the Continental Army, right behind Washington in seniority. And you've got to ask yourself, you're fighting in a revolution. Is it a healthy situation when your 2 top commanders, Washington and Lee, have political differences? Washington knew who his critics were. He also knew that Lee was friendly with those critics. He also knew that Lee had criticized him in late 1776 before he was captured. He also knew that Lee did not believe in Washington's emphasis on a professional American army. As professional as Washington could get that army, Lee did not believe that they could whip the redcoats in a stand-up battle. So he's a real question mark. Yet, look, let's keep in mind, he is a man to reckon with. If he ends up getting court-martialed after the Battle of Monmouth, we'll talk about that. But, God, most of you weren't even alive during the First Gulf War. name Norman Schwarzkopf ring a bell? If it doesn't ring a bell, Schwarzkopf was the American commander in Operation Desert Storm that pretty thoroughly chewed up the Iraqi army. If you can imagine Schwarzkopf coming back, expecting a hero's welcome, and instead Colin Powell, Army Chief of Staff, court-martials him for his trouble. You can imagine what the public reaction would have been. That's the public reaction we're talking about when Washington, after Monmouth, court-martials this guy. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's real politics of battle in that. What's another question we looked at? We're going to return to him. Beth, let's have another one. Okay. What did Charles Lee actually do at Monmouth? I'm going to spare you a bunch of battle maps, but just one I want to show you. On the morning of June 28th, Sunday, the title of the book, Fatal Sunday, Charles Lee is given discretionary orders by George Washington to take a vanguard of the Continental Army, which numbered about 15,000 men at this point, take 3,500 to 4,000 men, move forward on the British who are occupying the town of Freehold, Monmouth Courthouse. Close with them if you can. If you can land a blow, land a blow. Do not get yourself into trouble. I don't want to lose my vanguard. Now, you're talking about giving command of the vanguard to a guy who doesn't believe you can whip the British, to a guy who has very little faith in a professional American army. But he was the second ranking officer of the Patriot Professional Army. He had to do it, and we explain in the book why that had to happen. It was a pretty convoluted situation. Lee, in good faith, did attack. He goes in with about, as I said, 3,500 to 4,000 men, expecting to attack a British rear guard of about 800 men. All these various arrows. We have parts of Lee's vanguard moving out. They're moving out because all these red arrows represent about 8,000 British troops. Yeah, there was a British rear guard, but what the Americans didn't know was that just up the road and out of sight was the rest of the British Army moving out of Freehold. The minute their rear guard was attacked, Clinton orders Charles Lord Cornwallis, his second-ranking officer, to about face and get those guys. This was Clinton's chance. Is Washington attacking me? Thank God. This is my chance. And he hopes to at least annihilate that vanguard, and if Washington brings up the main army, he wants to hit them too. The reason I've showed you this slide was to get you some sense of the scope of the British counterattack. Lee didn't stand a chance, and he retreats in very good order. There's no panic. No American regiment broke under the onslaught. Lee is searching for a place to make a stand. He wants to fight, but he needs terrain. Remember that east-west bias? If you're attacking from this direction, you've got an advantage over anybody down here. Lee is searching desperately for some high ground, or at least some defensible ground. What happens while he is doing that is Washington comes up, and he's leading the main American army up. He comes forward. He doesn't know what's going on, and he finds Charles Lee retreating. This is, there's a picture, Emanuel Leutze, Washington crossing the Delaware, pretty famous, and standing in the boat with the flag and all that stuff. Same guy. And this is Washington rallying the troops at Monmouth. There's Washington, there's Charles Lee. Lee sees Washington coming up. He trots up to Washington thinking he's going to be congratulated for conducting such a masterful retreat. If so, it was the worst career decision he's ever made. Washington is furious, doesn't know what's going on. According to Lafayette, who wrote his memoirs some 40 years later, Washington calls Lee a damned poltroon. I had no idea what a poltroon was until I read the thing, the quote in Lafayette. It is not a compliment. In the 18th century, well, have you ever called anyone a poltroon? Has anyone ever called you a damned poltroon? And you say, huh? It's not a compliment. It would be Today, it would be you, begins with M, ends with R, and we won't go into that. But General Charles Scott, an American brigadier who had been part of that vanguard that's retreating, said Washington swore that day, the exact quote, he swore till the leaves shook on the trees. Actually, when all this took place, Charles Scott was maybe 3/4 of a mile away, which means he had the best hearing in all of American military history. There's no way that Washington actually unloaded on Lee. There was an exchange. What's going on? Well, you know, if you were going to attack, why didn't you go through with it? Very quickly, Washington realized what the situation was, and he gives Lee a choice. Stay forward, fight a delaying action, while I go back and organize the main army up on the Perrine Hill, or I'll stay forward, and you, Charles, you go back and organize the main army on Perrine Hill. Lee stays forward and fights an absolutely brilliant delaying action, some of the toughest fighting of the entire war. Okay. Another thing we had to deal with. Monmouth had all kinds of folkloric aspects, and one of the most popular was the whole issue of Molly Pitcher. Was there a Molly Pitcher? The answer is yes. We just don't know who exactly she was. She was probably Mary Macaulay, or Mary Hayes Macaulay, an Irish gal, probably born and raised around Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Certainly we can track her husband, who was in an artillery unit. The legend says that when her husband was down, either killed or fell through heat exhaustion, Molly picked up the rammer and began to serve the gun with him. We have eyewitness accounts by soldiers who wrote, kept journals, that there were women on the battlefield. We don't have any, there's no question about that. Did anybody call anybody Molly Pitcher? No. No, but her case is good enough so that Pennsylvania, after the war, actually gave her a military pension based on her service. What the mythic Molly Pitcher really stood for was the place of women in the Continental Army. Like the British Army, the Americans allowed a certain number of women to accompany each regiment. They helped forage, they helped nurse, they took in washing. All the back office type of stuff that it takes to keep an army in place. They also helped pillage. As the soldiers starved, they lived off the land, or if that meant liberating, to use that word, from local farms and even local homes, that's what it meant. But they were very much a part of that army, and there is no question that they were on the battlefield. There's some question as to where she would have gotten water and what was she doing. The answer probably lies in what it took to keep an artillery battery going in those days. It did take water, and the water wasn't just for the horses and for the men. Every gun was swabbed between rounds, and if you didn't have water, it meant the barrel was still hot, and as you rammed in a new charge, you risked blowing yourself up right off the spot. If you couldn't have water, you couldn't have artillery. Molly Pitcher probably did serve a gun, at least in one instance. She wasn't called Molly Pitcher till probably 40 years after the war, when she entered American mythology. It's best to see Mary Macaulay Hayes as representative of women in the Army generally. I don't think there was any question that there was more than one Molly Pitcher on the field at Monmouth, and I think Gary and I were able to dig out enough to support that in the book, and we do try to explain it as best we can. Okay, let's go to the next one. What were the results of all of this? Well, I mentioned I was going to give you one instance of where the archaeology and the history merged. This is the Perrine Heights that we saw on that map earlier. This is the main Continental infantry line, and these are the Patriot guns. This represents about 20 Patriot cannon. This is Lieutenant Colonel Henry Monckton of the British Grenadiers. Doesn't look like a real tough guy, does he? Looks like he was a hardened grenadier. The Grenadiers, every British regiment had 8 to 10 companies, and one company with light infantry. These were generally the youngest men, in good physical shape. They went out and did your scouting. They went out and did your skirmishing, provided a security screen. And then you had a company of grenadiers. These were your veterans, the toughest guys, generally big physical specimens. They were sent in. They were your stormtroopers. Given the toughest assignments, these would lead the attack. What they would do is, when they're on campaign and needed a bunch of grenadiers to hit a major target, they would take all those grenadier companies out of the regiments, put them together in a special battalion. Henry Monckton led the 2nd British Grenadiers. Clinton decided, as the battle was coming to a climax, he was going to try to break through and hit Washington's main line on Perrine Hill. Monckton led the charge across a bridge, across a swamp. That morass is still there. That bridge goes over 537, Chris? That, you know, the county road is still there. The bridge is in the same place where the original bridge was. The Grenadiers rushed over, and the American artillery destroyed them. We found this out. There was sort of rumors that the British might have tried to attack across that morass, might have tried to make a last gasp attack to break the American line. This is impact ammunition the archaeologists have dug up. And what it means is these grenadiers moved into a hail of grape shot. Grape shot was called, you took musket balls, you bound them in cloth so it looked like a bunch of grapes. You fired them out of a cannon. The cannon became a huge shotgun. With 20 guns working, firing about 2 to 3 rounds per minute, with about 30 pieces of musket balls, and the grape shot, do the math. 20 times 30 times 2. At any given moment, thousands of musket balls were headed downrange. The Grenadiers charged right into the middle of it. The battle lasted maybe a minute, no more than 2 minutes, before the Grenadiers were blown to bits. It was pretty appalling. We devoted a major chapter to the aftermath of the battle. What was it like trying to deal with the wounded, to walk the battlefield the following morning of the 29th of June and see who was still left. And we see the doctors that the Continentals did send out to try to deal with the British wounded down here, of young men virtually blown in two. It was simply a slaughter. And it gives us one sense of how violent. I mean, there's a lot of reenactors of the American Revolution, and I'm glad they're there because they're a great educational tool and everything. And they do a reenactment of the Battle of Monmouth almost every year at the state park. But what you don't get in these reenactments is a sense of just how ghastly a battle during the American Revolution could be. And I think as we began to recover that in our literary evidence and match it up with what happened here, you began to get a real sense that the American Revolution was no revolutionary immaculate conception. It was one through an astonishing amount of bloodshed and suffering. The combat at Monmouth was simply horrific. Let's do it again. After that, Clinton took off. He had stopped the Americans. He did not get the major engagement that he wanted. Oh, the mic. Sorry, Frank. The British left Monmouth. By July, the Royal Navy had ferried them back to New York. Washington did not chase him. Let's do it again. But what had happened? Okay. Washington's professional army proved itself. It was a tactical draw. Clinton, the Americans said, we got to win. Clinton scoffed at it. Lee had fought well, but he was angry at his confrontation with Washington, and he wrote Washington really insulting letters, and he demanded a court-martial. If you're in the 18th century and you're an officer and you think your honor has been impugned, you demand a court-martial, and you're acquitted with honor. That's the term. That's how you clear your name, and you embarrass those who accused you. Washington gladly gave him the court-martial and then stacked the court-martial board with officers he knew would come up with the appropriate verdict, guilty. And it brought the political fissures among patriots to a head. That court-martial electrified the country. Those who opposed Washington backed Lee when Congress was asked to certify the court-martial results. The political end game. Alexander Hamilton, John Lawrence, best friends and the key aides to General Washington, went to work on John Lawrence's father, Henry Lawrence, who just happened to be president of the Continental Congress. Had a lot of political influence, and after a real wrangling, it was the influence of these two men on this guy who was able to control Congress that relatively narrowly sustained the court-martial and convicted and got rid of Charles Lee. Washington, his critics are silenced. That's it. The Battle of Monmouth has sort of routed Washington's political opponents. And George ends up the man on the white horse for the first time. He is unchallenged for the rest of the American Revolution. He doesn't face any really stiff opposition until his second term as President of the United States. It's the Battle of Monmouth that put him over the top as the so-called indispensable man. And I think that's it, right? That is definitely it. Thank you very much. I know that down at Ocean, Dr. Esposito has purchased 10, 15 copies of this book. I can only tell you that they make wonderful gifts for all occasions. You can get to it through Amazon. Thanks very much. If anyone has questions, I'll hang around. Jerry, your hand went up first, I think. Yeah. What is exactly involved in Lee's delay? Don't you want to hear about Lee's delaying action? Look at these people getting up. No, you can leave. Go ahead. Yeah, so Lee hunkered down behind that hedgerow. And as the British came on, there were little guys literally jabbing at each other with bayonets on opposite sides of that hedgerow. They got off about 5 volleys, which means they were there for, it was probably over with in just a matter of minutes. But it was just enough time for Washington to bring up the main army on the Pirine Heights and be in a position to hold off that final British run. Lee deserves a lot of credit for making sure that Washington was able to fight effectively from that main line. So, no. He was suspended from command for a year, which everybody thought if the guy had disobeyed orders and not attacking as Washington wanted him to attack, it was way too light a sentence. Everybody sort of interpreted it, okay, they had to find him guilty because came down to a choice between him or George, and it wasn't going to be George who had to go. Everybody sort of saw it as a political verdict, and as it truly was, and we go into that in real depth. And then he was disgusted. He wrote a really nasty letter to Congress. You guys have been my friends, now you've let me down. He said things one ought not to say to a bunch of people he was writing to help him. He was, should we say, politically naive. And Congress wrote a letter back saying your services are no longer required. Adios. So, and they didn't say adios. They just, Jerry. That was Chernoff? Chernoff. How can I put this delicately? He's wrong. That's a great book, but in fact, we use him as a straw man. There's a long footnote saying he's wrong. He did. He did. Washington, John Lawrence, and Washington's very young staff, it's called his military family. They were all young. Lafayette, Lawrence, Hamilton, Fitzpatrick. There were about a dozen of them, and very loyal, very talented, very brave. I mean, they got out there. Hamilton's horse was shot out from under him as he was trying to get troops lined up behind that hedgerow, as Lee was organizing the. Look, the guy, he lost his head. Lee is put in charge. He's going to start organizing that stand behind the hedgerow. Hamilton rides up, swinging his sword, saying, "That's right, General, I will die with you on this spot," blah, blah, blah. Lee looks at him and says, "Let's get this organized first, then I'll die with you on this spot, but we got a job to do." Look, Hamilton's was probably the most brilliant brain of his generation, but on this particular moment, that brain was rattled. Yeah, I mean, look, he was, one of the reasons Hamilton left, you got to track him down individually, tell him wrong. One of the reasons Hamilton left Washington's staff was that Washington kept him on the staff. He wanted a field command. Again, he was 20 years old, for crying out loud. He was out there, I mean, they made no bones about it. There is no glory on the staff. These guys wanted to cut their reputations in the field. So, I mean, they were kids. I mean, Lawrence was 19 when this was going on. It was a young man's war, as it almost always is. Hi, Dennis. Going to any ball games, Dennis? Yeah, right. Okay. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Dennis. Good question. And for those who didn't hear, what was different between the draft in the 1990s and the final version? First, I came away convinced that the political opposition that Washington was facing was just more than political sniping. I am now convinced that it was a genuine threat to Washington's command, that there were influential Americans who genuinely wanted him out and tried to get him out. And I think I said that's leading to another book, specifically on the cabal. The other issue is, to what extent did Steuben's training at Valley Forge, and I simply didn't have time to go into that today, but to what extent did Steuben's training at Valley Forge influence how the Americans fought that battle? And I think the archaeological evidence really did clarify that. I mentioned the one piece that I thought was pretty dramatic today, but there were several others that clarified how the Americans engaged. They would have been incapable of doing that before the Valley Forge experience, and unless the archaeology had been completed, there's no way I could have made that case. Yeah. No, it wasn't. No, that was just my own research. My own research, right? Look, one advantage I had writing in 2011 or 2012 when I started this thing, the new draft, was that in the interim between the 1990s and 2012. There were several major papers publication projects. The George Washington papers have been vastly expanded, and now it's even online. The Hamilton Papers project has been completed. The papers of Henry Lawrence completed. The Nathaniel Greene papers, the papers of letters of delegates to Congress. This stuff was available, but scattered in archives all over the place. Now, they're easy to locate. I mean, if I had to dig this stuff out, and Gary had to dig stuff out, Gary literally digging, I didn't have to do that, I'd still be doing the research. Well, if that's it, thanks very much. Appreciate it.